I never thought a broken radiator could feel like a metaphor for my life. But there I was, leaning over the hood of a dusty sedan in the corner of Miller's Auto, listening to the hiss of escaping coolant and wishing for something undefined. That's when she walked in. Clara. I only knew her as the woman in 4B, the one with the quiet confidence that made the air in the hallway feel heavier. Not in a suffocating way. More like gravity had shifted slightly every time she moved, pulling things, people, even my thoughts, closer. She carried a leather satchel and the faint scent of vanilla mixed with old books, a smell that made me suddenly self-conscious about my own cologne, or lack thereof. She didn't look at me immediately. Her eyes scanned the room with that subtle, practiced detachment you see in people who have been measured by life and decided to measure life back. And then, a pause. Her gaze met mine, just long enough to make my chest tighten. I wanted to say something clever. I wanted to disappear. Instead, I said nothing. "Car won't start," she asked finally, her voice low, even, like it could have been mistaken for calm or dismissal. "Yeah, radiator's shot," I replied, hoping my voice sounded more confident than it felt. She nodded, leaning against the counter with a posture that suggested she belonged wherever she chose, even in a cluttered workshop smelling of oil and rust. I noticed her hands, the subtle way she curled her fingers around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking yet. There was a rhythm to her movements that made me watch instead of breathe. "You're new here?" she asked after a moment, tilting her head, studying me the way someone looks at a painting, curious but not obliged to comment. "Sort of. Just helping out this week." I tried to sound casual, but I could hear the tremor in my own words. A pause stretched between us. One of those silences that doesn't need filling, but still hums with electricity. She smiled, small, almost imperceptible, and immediately looked away, fiddling with her satchel strap. My stomach nodded. Then she did something that, in retrospect, I would replay for hours. She leaned a fraction closer and handed me a pen I had dropped behind the counter. Our fingers brushed, brief, accidental, and yet it felt deliberate, as though time had condensed into that fleeting contact. "Thanks," I said, and the words sounded hollow in my ears, but she didn't notice. She gave a soft nod and stepped back, crossing the room to the window, where she rested against the frame like she owned the light streaming through it. I kept thinking about her gaze, the way she had measured me without words, the quiet intensity that made me feel like I'd been waiting for a sign I hadn't even known I was looking for. And I realized, without wanting to, that I couldn't stop thinking about it. About her. About that brush of hands that seemed like a question I wasn't ready to answer. When she finally left, the bell above the door jingling softly, I stayed by the car, staring at the spot where she'd stood. My hands still smelled faintly of grease, and yet I felt, strangely electrified, like a part of me had woken up while she was here. I didn't know her, not really, and maybe I never would. But something in that moment whispered that timing was only a suggestion, and maybe, just maybe, feeling was something you couldn't ever postpone. And now I catch myself, often, looking toward her door in the hallway, wondering if she even remembers my name, or the touch of my fingers against hers. I found her in the lobby of her building the next afternoon, leaning against the mailboxes like she had all the time in the world. She was holding a stack of packages, one hand cradling them, the other brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. I offered to help, and she hesitated, just a flicker in her eyes that made me stop mid-step. "Are you sure?" she asked, voice soft measured. But her hands trembled slightly under the weight, and I caught it. "Yeah, I can carry the big one," I said, shifting a box onto my shoulder. She gave a tight nod and allowed me to take it, though her eyes kept darting away, scanning the hallway like she was expecting someone, or maybe trying to hide from someone. As we walked toward her apartment, I noticed the faint crease under her eyes, the subtle tension in her shoulders. She moved with that same careful grace, but there was a fragility in the way she exhaled when we reached the elevator. It was brief, almost imperceptible, like she didn't want me to see it, yet I couldn't not see. We stood in the elevator, the silence thick but not awkward, just charged. She pressed the button for her floor, and her fingers lingered on it longer than necessary, brushing against mine. I felt a small jolt, and I caught myself holding my breath. "You're always this helpful?" she asked, finally, but her eyes weren't really looking at me. They were fixed on the mirrored wall, on some reflection she wasn't sharing. "I try," I said, too casual. I wanted to ask what she was thinking, why there was this heaviness beneath her elegance, but the words caught in my throat. When we reached her door, she paused, fumbling with her keys, her lips pressed together in a line that made her look almost younger, almost fragile. "Thanks," she said finally, a little breathless, and I realized she wasn't just thanking me for the box. There was something else tucked in there: hesitation, relief, a flicker of trust. I wanted to reach out, touch her hand, ask if she was okay. But instead, I simply watched, noticing the way her nails caught the light, the faint rhythm of her breathing, the weight in her posture that seemed to say she was carrying more than packages. She opened the door, and I handed over the last box. Our fingers brushed again, softer this time, lingering just long enough for her to look up at me. For a heartbeat, our eyes met fully, and there it was, that quiet, unspoken energy, impossible to name, forbidden by circumstance but undeniable. She gave a half-smile, the kind that doesn't quite reach her eyes, and disappeared inside. I stayed in the hallway, the scent of her perfume lingering, my hand still tingling from that second brush. I didn't move immediately. I didn't want to. I just stood there, noticing how her presence could occupy a space without speaking, without touching, and still leave me tangled in thought. Even now, I can't stop replaying that moment. The way her laugh had briefly escaped as she muttered to herself while arranging the boxes, the small sigh of fatigue she tried to hide, the soft weight of her hand against mine. Something about it pressed into me like gravity, drawing me closer in ways I shouldn't, in ways I couldn't resist. The rain started just as we were finishing up in the small hotel library she volunteered at, rows of old books smelling faintly of paper and polish. She was perched on a ladder, dusting the top shelves, and I was crouched beside a stack of returned novels, pretending to be busy. But I couldn't stop noticing the way her hair clung slightly to her neck from the damp air, the way her scarf had slipped off one shoulder, and how the quiet hum of the storm outside seemed to match the tension in the room. "You're unusually quiet tonight," she said, her voice low, almost hesitant. I looked up at her, and for a second, it felt like the world had contracted to just us. "Just concentrating," I muttered, though my fingers were trembling slightly as I stacked the books. She laughed softly, a brief, imperfect sound, and I realized she had no idea how much that single laugh could unravel me. We both reached for the same book at the same time, and our hands collided. Neither of us moved away immediately. My palm brushed hers, and I caught myself staring, caught between wanting to pull back and wanting to linger just a moment longer. She noticed the pause too, but instead of saying anything, she cleared her throat and shifted, giving me a glance that was equal parts teasing and caution. The storm rattled the windows, and for a heartbeat I imagined we could forget everything outside, the world, expectations, distance, and just exist in that suspended space. I wanted to say something, a whisper of confession, or even just the truth about how hard it was to keep my distance. But the words wouldn't come. They lodged somewhere in my chest, heavy and insistent. Then her phone buzzed sharply against the wooden desk, breaking the spell. She glanced at it, frowning. "I should take this," she said, standing and smoothing down her sweater as if it were a shield against the tension. I nodded, trying to tamp down the disappointment that fluttered in my stomach. "Of course," I said, and as she stepped toward the doorway, I caught the slight hesitation in her step, the almost imperceptible way her eyes lingered on me before she left. I wanted to reach for her hand, to stop her, to say, "Don't go yet. I need to tell you something." But instead, I stayed crouched by the books, my fingers brushing the edge of a shelf, imagining what it would feel like to close the distance between us, to let the tension finally speak in something more than glances. The library was quiet again, save for the storm outside. My chest felt tight, my thoughts scattered with what-ifs and almosts. I kept thinking about that brush of her fingers, the way she smelled faintly of rain and lavender, and how close we had come to something that both terrified and exhilarated me. I didn't move when she left. I didn't call her back. I just sat there, imagining the moment where proximity could have changed everything. Just a hair's breadth between restraint and surrender, and realizing that maybe, sometimes, the most electric moments are the ones you never act on. The workshop smelled of oil and damp concrete, a faint tang of metal lingering in the air. She was leaning against the workbench, arms crossed, eyes not quite meeting mine. I'd been cleaning tools for the last 10 minutes, pretending that the scrape of a wrench or the clink of a socket could drown out the tension between us. Finally, she spoke, almost a whisper. "Do you ever wonder what we're doing here?" I froze, a rag in my hand, and tried to figure out how to answer without sounding foolish. What do you mean?" My voice cracked slightly, and I hated it. She looked at me then, really looked, as if she was trying to see through something I hadn't even admitted to myself. "I mean this. Us. The way it feels like something we're pretending is normal when it's not. When every glance, every pause, every word, it's something else, isn't it?" I swallowed hard. I wanted to nod, to deny it, to hide behind casualness, but her eyes made it impossible. They weren't accusatory, just open, raw, almost pleading for honesty I didn't have the courage to give. I put down the wrench and ran a hand through my hair, suddenly aware of the space between us, the air thick with things unspoken. She shifted slightly, the faint sound of leather brushing against wood, and I noticed how tired she looked, the shadows under her eyes, the slight slump in her shoulders. I wanted to reach out, to say something, anything, but the words tangled themselves in my chest. Silence stretched, heavy, almost unbearable. My hands ached to move toward her, to close the distance, but my mind was a knot of hesitation and fear. She didn't step away. She didn't move closer. She just stood there, waiting, watching, letting the unspoken press against both of us like a weight we couldn't shrug off. "What if?" I finally murmured, my voice barely above the hum of the overhead lights. "What if we're feeling something we're not supposed to?" Her eyes flicked down, then back up at me, and I saw a flash of something that made my chest tighten. Confusion, fear, longing, all tangled together. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "I don't know," she said. The words were fragile, like they could break if spoken too loudly. We just stood there, letting the silence fill the gaps between our words. Every second was loaded, every breath heavy. I wanted to ask more, to confess, to unravel the tension with some declaration, but the fear of what that would do kept me still. And then she did something I didn't expect. She pressed her hand against the bench, leaned in just enough for her hair to brush against my arm, and said, almost as if to herself, "I think. I'm afraid of feeling this." I swallowed again. My fingers twitched at my sides. I wanted to tell her she wasn't alone, that I felt it too, that I was scared in exactly the same way, but the words wouldn't come. She straightened slowly, stepping back, leaving that charged space between us unbroken. And in the quiet aftermath, I realized something I couldn't ignore. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," she whispered, barely audible, but it landed in me like a stone. I found her sitting on the worn couch in the back corner of the bookstore, the one with the faded cushions and stacks of unsorted novels. She was holding an old, yellowed envelope, fingertips tracing the edges like it carried the weight of the world. I hesitated at the doorway, pretending to browse a shelf, but I couldn't look away. She looked up, startled, then quickly covered her expression with a small, forced smile. "It's nothing," she said, though her voice had that brittle quality that made me certain it was everything. "Looks like it means a lot," I said softly, stepping closer. She shifted, and I noticed her hands tremble, slight, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my stomach tighten. It's from him," she admitted, her eyes glancing away to the dusty floor. "From a long time ago." Her voice caught, and I realized she wasn't speaking about just anyone. There was a quiet vulnerability there, the kind that only surfaces when someone has let themselves be seen before and been hurt. I wanted to say something, anything, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I just watched her, noticing the way her shoulders slumped slightly, the faint tension in her jaw. She wasn't dramatic. She didn't collapse or sob. She just existed in that fragile, aching space, and it shook something loose inside me. I thought I'd moved on, she whispered, tracing the handwriting on the envelope. I thought I had, but sometimes it just comes back, like it never left. Her gaze lifted toward me, hesitant, searching, almost accusing, but not really. Do you understand? I did, in a way I didn't expect. I reached for the envelope gently, not to take it from her, but just to touch the same space she had been touching. I think I do, I said quietly. Some memories, they don't let go, even when you think you're ready. She looked at me, and for the first time, there was no guard at all. Just the raw, fragile honesty of someone who had loved and lost, and carried it all quietly, like an invisible weight. I wanted to say her name. I wanted to offer some magic fix, some reassurance, but all I could do was stay there, breathing the same air, letting her know she wasn't alone in that moment. She smiled faintly, a fragile thing, almost like a sigh. It's stupid, she muttered, laughing softly at herself. I shouldn't let it affect me still. But it does. I don't think it's stupid, I said. I think it's human. A soft rain began tapping against the windows, and for a moment, the bookstore felt suspended outside time. I noticed the way the light caught her hair, the small line of tension easing from her shoulders, and the way her hands shook slightly less now, almost as if my presence had anchored her. Then she leaned back into the couch, clutching the envelope to her chest, and for the first time, I saw the vulnerability behind the confident, layered woman I thought I knew. And in that quiet, charged moment, I realized something terrifying and exhilarating at once. I wanted to hold her, not in a way to fix her, but just to share the weight of what she carried. And somehow, just knowing that, just being there, felt like the most intimate thing I'd ever done. The cafe was nearly empty, mid-afternoon sunlight slicing through the blinds, dust motes drifting in the golden light. She sat across from me, a steaming cup of tea warming her hands, and I realized I hadn't been able to stop noticing the way she held it, delicate, careful, like it needed anchoring. We didn't speak at first, just sat, breathing in the quiet rhythm of the cafe, the faint clink of a spoon against porcelain, the soft whir of the espresso machine, the occasional murmur from a distant table. I felt the weight of everything we hadn't said, pressing lightly against us, and somehow it felt less suffocating than it should. You, she began, then stopped, glancing down at her cup. I think we both know we've been avoiding it. I nodded slowly, tracing the rim of my own mug. Yeah, I said, quietly, almost like I was afraid the words would make it real. I think we do. She looked up, and for the first time in weeks, our eyes met fully, without hesitation, without guarding. There was a softness there, recognition, relief, a trace of longing that didn't need to be named. We didn't need to speak the words. We just existed in that space, acknowledging the quiet truth between us. I reached out slowly, almost tentatively, and let my hand brush hers on the table. Not a dramatic gesture, just a touch, an acknowledgement, a shared grounding in reality. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her hand slightly, letting the warmth linger, subtle but full of meaning. I could feel the tension of weeks, months, dissolving in that small contact, the uncertainty ebbing away into something inevitable, earned. I like this, she whispered, voice soft, almost vulnerable, and I realized it wasn't about the touch itself. It was about the permission to feel, to simply be, without pretense or fear. Me too, I said, and neither of us needed to clarify. The words were enough. Enough to acknowledge, not to declare, enough to lean into the quiet gravity that had been pulling us toward each other from the beginning. We sat like that for a long while, just holding space together. Sunlight shifted across the table, shadows dancing gently on her face, highlighting the faint lines that told me she had lived, suffered, loved before. And yet, somehow, that made her presence next to me feel all the more real, all the more tangible, all the more earned. Eventually, we let our hands rest lightly on the table, fingertips occasionally brushing, sharing a quiet understanding that this was no fairy tale, but it was ours, authentic and imperfect. I didn't know what came next. I didn't care. For the first time, I felt certain that whatever it was, we would navigate it together. When she finally leaned back, exhaling softly, I noticed a small smile tug at the corner of her lips. I mirrored it without thinking, and in that simple, unspoken exchange, the tension, the longing, the uncertainty, it all folded into quiet finality. No declarations, no dramatic gestures, just presence, just us. And somehow that was enough. It's been months since that afternoon in the cafe, but I can still feel the faint warmth of her hand brushing mine across the table. It's funny how some moments don't really leave you, even when life keeps moving forward, pulling you in a dozen directions at once. We settled into a rhythm neither of us planned, built slowly, carefully, like stacking fragile books on an old shelf. There's no rush, no grand declarations, just shared spaces, quiet understanding, and the little ways we notice each other. Her laugh still catches me off guard sometimes, the same way it did the first time I heard it, fragile but alive. And I've noticed how I breathe differently when she's near, less on edge, more present, like her calm seeps into me without effort. I think the biggest change is that we both stopped pretending life was simpler than it is. We acknowledge our pasts, our scars, the weight we carry, but we do it together, not as a solution, just as company. I've learned that love isn't always a spark or a confession. Sometimes, it's the quiet persistence of noticing someone, choosing to be there, choosing to linger in the spaces between words and silences. She's changed too, though not in ways anyone else would notice. There's a softness now when she looks at me, not vulnerability, not fragility, but a kind of trust that took time to grow. A willingness to let someone see the edges she usually keeps sharpened. And I think that's what makes it real. The patience, the imperfection, the knowledge that we can exist fully and still stumble, still recover, still feel. I catch myself smiling sometimes, remembering the small moments that made everything shift, the brush of fingers in the bookstore, the shared silence in the library, the envelope she clutched as if it carried her entire past. Those little fractures of time taught me more about connection than any dramatic declaration ever could. And so, we move forward, together, in the quiet way that feels impossible to manufacture, the slow accumulation of understanding, respect, and care. It's not cinematic. It's human, messy, real, and it's ours. Sometimes I wonder if she notices how much I've changed. I hope she does, but maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is that we've learned how to be with each other in ways that don't need perfection, just presence. The light shifts through the apartment window, the coffee steams gently in our mugs, and I glance at her reading quietly on the couch. I feel that familiar pull, the one that's no longer frantic, no longer fraught, just steady, grounding. And I realize that some moments, some connections, linger far beyond the first spark, far beyond the hesitation, far beyond the almosts. If you've ever felt something you couldn't name, or someone who changed you without even trying, maybe you'll understand what I mean. And now, I'd love to know, have you ever met someone who made ordinary moments feel extraordinary?